Okay, here's today's Agile Nudge. Now this one is slightly different, and I'll tell you why. This is the second take. I always try and do it just on the first take, which is why it's rough and ready. So here's another go at it. Today's Agile Nudge is about the mnemonic invest, and why we want, when we bring work into a sprint, into the sprint backlog, when we meet definition of ready, why this is useful. So definition of ready, any team that pulls work in needs to know what they're doing and make sure that they can do the work, because there's no point spending time, effort, energy and money on something if you can't deliver value almost immediately. So every team is going to have a unique definition of ready, and it's going to be based on your context. It's going to be based on your own experience, the work you're doing, the people in the team, and it's quite fluid as well, so it will evolve and change as the team matures, and that's fine. But there is one heuristic or rule of thumb that every team would benefit from aspiring to achieve. And it's this mnemonic here, invest. It stands for independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, small, and testable. So let's go through each one. Independent. Any piece of work that you bring in would ideally be able to be delivered to the customer as a standalone piece of functionality. That's really challenging, that's really hard, but what we don't want is interdependency between lots of stories where nothing is valuable to the customer until everything is delivered. So we try and get it to be independent. Negotiable. So you can continue to negotiate with your product owner and with the team the extent of the scope, and you can de-scope as you go. And even during the sprint, you can continue to negotiate within reasonable limits as you learn more in this volatile, uncertain way of working. But at the sprint planning, you should be able to negotiate with your product owner. Valuable. Ask yourself the question, does our end customer care about this? Are we impacting or changing the lives of the people we want to? And that's a really important question to ask. It could also mean knowledge value. Are we going to learn something from this? Estimable. So can we, in pulling this work in, estimate it? There's an important thing here, by the way. It says estimable, not estimated. So it's not estimated work. I have a personal position that we shouldn't be doing planning poker in backlog refinement. Maybe a rule of thumb and a five-fingered vote or something to say, yeah, it feels small enough. But I prefer to do planning poker and detailed forecasting and estimating within sprint planning, which is why for me it's often a little bit longer than many other teams. So estimable, we should be able to estimate the work. Small, this means, is it small enough to be pulled into the sprint? If it's larger than the sprint, obviously at the end of the sprint, we will not have delivered value to the customer. And one of the lean principles that we try and aspire to achieve is minimizing the batch size. And that improves the flow and improves the feedback. It shortens the feedback loop. So we want to be small. And testable. How do we know we delivered value? Well, we need to test it. So we need to find out before we start, how are we going to test this? What metrics are we going to use? And how can we test it? If we can't test it, it's not really ready to do the work on it. So, now the interesting thing, negotiable. Actually, all of these are negotiable in themselves. So if you pull in a story that isn't quite independent, well, in this case, maybe we can breach that rule because it's more of a guideline than a rule. Valuable, well, the customer doesn't care. Might not learn anything about it, but it's something we sort of need to do, but we can't express value. Let's negotiate that as well. All of these are negotiable. The one that's least negotiable, in my mind at least, is small, which is why I've underlined it. And the reason is I think we should be very careful not to pull in work that's too large, and we should always challenge ourselves to slice user stories down, because there's more benefit in doing that. And often with new teams, I'm told, we can't slice this story any smaller. And my answer is, try. And we can always find ways to do it. In particular, I've just been asked this question, so this is going to be a bit longer than a normal nudge, I think. In the definition of ready, this team said, we want to only have stories below a 13. This is a team that typically achieves 40 points per sprint. So 13 points. And a rule of thumb is, I would say, often try and keep a story below half that of the length of the sprint. So if you normally achieve 40 points in a sprint, less than 20 would be good. And then somebody said, really? That's limiting yourself by saying it's a hard and fast rule not to pull in larger than 13. So in planning, if you were to estimate and it came out larger than 13, as a Scrum Master, I would be saying, how can we slice it? And I would continue to challenge. How can we negotiate scope down? And we really want to try and make it smaller. But that's not to say it's the law, we never do it, it's some kind of law of physics. Sure, if you estimate it to be slightly larger, you know you're making a risk that you may fail the whole sprint and deliver nothing if you can't deliver it. So I challenge you to try and make it small, and that would be of all of them the least negotiable, but bear in mind all of them are negotiable. So that's my take on invest as part of definition of ready, which is an important part of how we scrum and how we work, because it helps derive clarity and a shared understanding within the team. I hope you enjoyed this Agile Nudge. I'll see you tomorrow for the next one.